We live in a time of weakness. I think we all feel a lot of different forms of weakness, whether many are feeling weakness within their body due to illness or older age. We are a society that I think many people would agree, maybe many men here would agree, is filled with weak men right now. We've got weak political leadership in many ways. We're weak in unity within the church and within our society abroad. Churches are feeling weak in a way that they've never felt weak. Societally, culturally, we don't have the power or the sway that we used to. I've seen a lot of us have to go through periods of weakness. I myself can say that, I know I'm still relatively young, but as I get older, I do feel weakness creeping in. We went ice skating on Friday, and I fell more times than planned, and I'm still feeling it. I'm not as fit as I once was. I also have walked along with a number of people in both churches as they have, especially in older years, really encountered great weakness and pain and suffering. And that's the thing is, even when it's not actual pain, weakness is often painful or uncomfortable. It's something that nobody enjoys. Somehow weakness always feels wrong. Like that's not how things are supposed to be. And one reaction can be to kind of insist, toughen up. Let's get stronger, that in response to weakness, we try to somehow make ourselves strong. And that's very understandable, and in some ways that is what's needed in our society and in our churches. But it's really important for us to ask in what ways we are weak or strong, in what ways God is calling us to be weak or strong. And so today in these different scriptures, there are kind of hints of the idea of weakness in many of them. And it's good for us to, as I've in recent weeks been focusing on the universal call of all Christians, what we are all called to, we need to focus on some of the basics today, which are that for all people everywhere, but especially for learn that God is strong, and we are not. That's a fundamental difference between God and us. He's strong, almighty, and we are weak and small. We also need to remember that fundamental truth that God gives strength to the weak. Right? As we read in that Isaiah passage that so many of us love, that he gives strength to the weary. And so, finally, we need to remember, these two are kind of related, that God gives strength to people in weakness. We are a people who become strong by becoming weak. It's kind of a paradox that to be a Christian is to intentionally become weak for the sake of others. And that's something that we are all called to. As God in Jesus became weak to make us strong, so we are called to become weak to make others strong. So, just some quick reminders. Psalm 147 was a great psalm to remind us of God's power. It talks about how he makes the rain to fall and he, refreshes the earth, and how he puts all the stars into the sky and calls them each by name. And it's a beautiful picture and reminder of just how sovereign God is, that he is really, truly over everything. And also in our Isaiah passage, we're reminded that his strength is not just in creation, but his strength is in judgment. He's not, having a hard time keeping up with all of our chaos or all of our injustice. God is going to bring justice to all of the injustice. He will set everything right, is in large part what the passage we were reading today is about. And so he's not getting worn out with time. He's no less strong today than he's ever been. And it's important for us to remember that, because I don't struggle with this, but I know that there are other people who do, that they wonder if God's paying attention, or if God is maybe can't handle me in particular, or he can't handle certain situations. There are some people who think that their sin is too great for God's mercy or his grace, which of course is not true. But there are many ways in which different believers are tempted to question whether God is in some way really as powerful as Scripture says he is. And so we just need to reaffirm that basic truth. He is not lacking in power in any way. There is nothing that he is incapable of. He can do all things. And we should, anytime that temptation comes to question him in his power, rebuke it and confess again that he is almighty and that he will indeed bring new life and justice. So God is strong. He's almighty. And then that next confession that we all have to confess is that we are weak, which is hard for a lot of us because a lot of us, not all of us, but some of us feel strong. Now, that's not true. I know that, or that's not true for everybody. I do know some people who always feel weak, have always felt incredibly weak. But if you're like me, one part of my failure is that I fail to realize just how weak I am a lot of the time. And there's something very human about that. I've heard a few times serving in these two churches, that when you get older, you don't feel, in some ways, like you're older. Like I've heard people who were in their 90s say that I feel like I'm still 20 years old. Maybe not physically, but inside, they still don't think of themselves as 90-some years old. And I see some smiles. I'm suspecting that maybe there's a reality where that's true for many of you, that, I think I can even say I still feel like I'm in my 20s. But then I get daily reminders that that's not really true. So for many humans, our automatic disposition is to feel strong, and then when weakness comes, we're surprised and caught off guard, or we're discomforted by it. You know, when we suddenly come down with the flu or end up puking our guts out, we realize just how weak we are. You know, the guys in the room all fall apart and think we're going to die, and our wives have to take care of us because we got sick for 3 days. I just talked to my friend this week who, his wife said he forgets to drink water. You know, I always thought my mom was silly for telling me to drink water when I'm sick, but apparently some of us need reminders. When we get sick, it really undoes a lot of us. We're not really prepared for that reality, and I think that reveals that we kind of assume strength, assume health. And in some ways, that's because God intended us to be healthy and strong. And we naturally don't really take sin and death into account. It feels unnatural and wrong. And so when we're visited by the effects of sin, which are illness and death, it doesn't feel right. It feels strange and unwelcome. And so we can see some signs of this reality of our weakness in our scriptures today. Psalm 147 mentioned God being near to the brokenhearted. And that's one form of weakness that we all experience. We all, sadly, at some time go through a period where we know, where we experience great tragedy. And that gives us a profound sense of weakness or powerlessness when a loved one dies or is greatly ill. When our hearts are broken, we know how small we are and how weak we are. We also read in our scriptures, he doesn't delight in the strength of horses or of men's legs. I think that's like an image of, physical strength, but he delights in those who fear the Lord. And so we also know physical weakness, or perhaps the image here is military weakness. But in a sense, there are all kinds of weakness that we all have to experience, whether it's emotional or physical. And in 1 Corinthians, we're even told that the weakness is not just a physical or a human reality. He calls the gospel, he says that what we believe is weakness or foolishness to the world. And so there's a sense in which, as Christians, we are those people who are called to know, especially, that we're weak. Because we believe in God who is almighty, but also to confess that we're weak is kind of the foundation of being able to ask Jesus to save you. Because if you say, I am weak, you're not strong enough to save yourself. Right? And so we all have to come to that rock bottom, in a sense. And if we don't, life has a way of forcing us to hit rock bottom, hopefully so that we can admit and confess our weakness. So weakness lies at the foundation of what it means to be human, but to be Christian is to not only confess, but embrace and realize every day just how weak we are. And that's important for us to remember because we are always met again and again with temptations to try to make ourselves strong, to lift ourselves up by our own bootstraps, That's kind of an American virtue to live a life that every time we feel weak, we're kind of in denial and we fight against it and we try to feel strong again or force life around us to bend and change so that we can feel strong again. Or a temptation can even creep in for us to think that weakness is inherently wrong. There are some machismo guys out there who hate so much the weak men that they're seeing around them that they are embracing a kind of manliness on the other end of the spectrum that's just a little too manly, just a little too strong, and thinks that weakness is wrong or a problem. And if you can't embrace weakness, then you can't be a Christian. So there are temptations we're met with in our weakness, to deny our weakness, to avoid it, or to live a life that is always trying to become stronger. And that's a real danger for us. And so all people, but especially all Christians, are called to confess, only God is truly almighty. He is powerful. I am weak. We are weak. And there's no escaping that. But then, of course, we read that God makes us strong. So there's this weird thing. We live a life of, we never get out of confessing our weakness, knowing our weakness. And yet we're always calling out to a God to make us strong, to give us strength, to be faithful, to cling to him, to stay near, to be hopeful. And there are all kinds of ways in which we do this. So think about just a couple of ways in which we are weak. In the Isaiah 40 passage, as I told you, the people have been, languishing. They've been suffering in a foreign nation, in captivity, and they've been crying out to God to save them. And finally, in this chapter, he's saying, I will comfort my people. I'm going to bring you out. But the people are questioning God, and they're saying, has he forgotten our plight? Has he forgotten how bad it is for us here? Is he not able to really deliver us out of this situation? Is he tired? Has he grown weak? And so that passage, it says multiple times, have you not heard? Do you not know? He never grows weak. He never grows tired or weary. He is always perfectly powerful and able to strengthen those who are weak. And then we have that beautiful passage about lifting us up on eagle's wings, which we kind of sang. And so, in a way, what God's people are calling out, they're feeling their weakness, their powerlessness to provide their own justice. They can't save themselves. They are suffering from injustice, and they cannot provide justice. And so they have to wait on God to do it. And so still today, we believe that our God is a God of justice who helps those who are powerless and cannot provide their own justice, right? Historically, he has always done that. There are groups of people who are abused and ignored and left on the margins of society, and God has always cared for those people. He has always cared for the poor and the powerless. And he not only cares for them, he gives them strength to carry on, to perhaps forgive, strength to wait on God, and to trust that he will bring justice. There's another kind of weakness that we see in our scriptures today, which is like physical or military weakness. It talks about God does not delight in the strength of a horse, which is a symbol for military strength or for physical strength. And so all throughout the scriptures, we see that Israel doesn't win because they have the biggest army or because they have the most horses. They always win because God gives them the victory. So we have stories where he tells them, like, send 9/10 of your troops home. You don't need them. You'll defeat this huge army with just 300 people, And then he miraculously gives them victory over an enormous, powerful enemy. And so still today, we need to remember that I think it's important for us to say things like, we're not going to be saved by America's military might. Sure feels safe, sure feels good to know that we've got one of the biggest militaries in the world, but that's not what's going to save us or give us power or make us right with God. Victory is given from God, and it doesn't matter how big your army is, how much technological advancement you've made. God is the one who determines military might. It's also important for us to remember a different kind of affliction. Today we read about Jesus ministering to those who are sick and demon-possessed. And that's always been a reality of humanity. We have always had people among us who were sick because of various kinds of affliction, physically sick or spiritually sick with demonic powers oppressing them. And so God has come not just to comfort them, but to strengthen them as well. And so we have God in Jesus coming to the sick and the demon-possessed and healing them and casting out the demons and giving them freedom. We also have a different kind of weakness. In 1 Corinthians, Paul, I don't know if y'all remember it, but I think a week or two ago, we read about people who have weak consciences, he talks about people who are really vulnerable and are easily influenced. And he says, he talks about people eating food that's been sacrificed to idols. And he says some of the people in the church might see you eating food sacrificed to idols, and their conscience, which is weak, will be wounded, and they will maybe eat the food sacrificed to idols too, or they might question what is really right as a Christian. And so there's such a thing as being a Christian and having a conscience that's weak, very sensitive, Christians who are always worried about doing the wrong thing. And God has come to make all of us, but also especially those who are weak in their conscience, to give us strength, to make us powerful in our belief and not fearful that we're always going to step across the line and do something wrong with God. And also in that passage, he talks to us about loving one another in such a way that we don't cause each other to stumble. And so one way in which God gives us strength in our weakness is that he gives us brothers and sisters who help encourage us and help us to stay strong in our faith. So, we had the basic confession that God is powerful. We also had the basic confession that we are weak. And then just now, we talked about how God makes the weak strong. And it's important for us to really remember that our calling, again, isn't to always be strong. Our calling is to be weak and to trust that God will make us strong. And there's a difference in that. There is strength in weakness. Okay, so there's a person in Blackwell right now who is a member of the Blackwell Church who is dying of cancer. But when you visit that person, you wouldn't know it because they are so strong in their faith, and they have been growing in strength every day. As their body is deteriorating, as they've been as they've been experiencing more and more pain, and they are approaching death quite certainly, that person has been a light to everybody who's gone to visit them. When people come and visit them, they talk, and everybody leaves strengthened in their faith because that person is so close to the Lord. And it's really their weakness that brought them close. For all their lives, they kind of took God for granted and their faith for granted. But once they were trapped in their bed and they could go nowhere, they started reading the Bible. And they started praying more. And every time I go and visit that person, it encourages me as their pastor. It strengthens me because they are getting so much closer to God. That person is now stronger than they've ever been. And they are physically weaker and in more pain than they've ever been. You understand? To be a Christian is to be able to be as weak as it gets and yet be stronger than anybody else. There is strength and weakness when we know Jesus. And that's really important for everybody here to claim for themselves. See, part of the reality is you are going to be made weak one way or another. If you live your life ignoring your weakness, trying to be strong, enjoying your health, but not embracing your weakness as a human and as a follower of Jesus, you will face affliction and problems that will make you weak. Life will break you. At the end, death will break you. Death will show you your weakness. All of us have to face it. The pain that comes from illness and the pain that comes from dying. And I've seen it happen over and over again. People who were healthy their whole lives and then in their late 80s or 90s get sick, and all of a sudden they realize how weak they are. And it's almost unbearable. It's like they can barely carry on through the day feeling their weakness all day and the pain of their weakness. And so one thing I want to warn us about today is and to encourage us to do is to embrace our weakness before it's forced on us. Before your body makes you realize just how weak and puny you are, embrace your weakness now. So that when that bodily pain and weakness comes, you have the faith to meet it. You have that spiritual strength to carry you through. There's almost nothing worse than getting to your deathbed and realizing that you were never strong in your faith. To get to your deathbed and not be used to praying. I know people who it wasn't until their dying days that they actually started praying, although they had been in church their whole lives. I visited people in their homes and said, well, when do you pray or what do you pray? And they said, well, I've never really prayed. Friends, today's the day to be weak. Today's the day to pray. Remember that Jesus in his ministry, he heals all these people, he casts out demons, and then at the end of our passage, what does he do? He goes out alone to pray, right? Even Jesus, the Son of God, went out to pray. He was dependent on his Father at all times, and he lived a life of prayer. And so, here's the final point. All Christians are called to make ourselves weak. Not just to embrace weakness, but to make ourselves weak. And there are a number of ways in which we do that. First of all, remember that Jesus made himself weak, right? He was eternal God, but he became a human and limited himself for our sake. And so he came down from heaven, and there he met people who were sick and oppressed by demons, and he healed and cast out the demons. He became weak to make others strong. But he didn't stop there, right? He then became even weaker by going to the cross and dying in order to accomplish that forgiveness and that healing for all those who call on him, salvation. And Jesus did that ministry of making others strong by becoming weak and by living a life of prayer. Prayer is that intentional embrace of our weakness. Every time you go to your knees, every time you pray to God, you are admitting that you are weak. You are admitting that you need God to do what you can't. And the more you pray, the more you realize you need God for everything. And that you can do nothing unless you ask him for it. And so we are the people who follow Jesus. Jesus descended from heaven and descended to the cross in order to exalt us, to strengthen us. And we are those who follow him. He said, if you would be my disciple, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. We are the people who are following Jesus to a cross. Paul took that. He said, I have made myself a slave to all men so that by all means I might save some. Paul was following Jesus, right? He said, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those without the law, I became like one without the law. To the weak, I became weak. Paul made himself a servant. He made himself weak for all people so that he could strengthen those who are weak because he was a follower of Jesus. You see that? Jesus made himself weak for others. Paul made himself weak for others. We are called to make ourselves weak for others. And so I want to call us to do that in a couple of ways. Personally, yes, embrace your weakness. But we as a church need to embrace our weakness. The church, all in the West, has lost its cultural sway. Like, people don't care what the church has to say anymore. Our culture doesn't care what Jesus has to say anymore. And so we're not the popular kids on the block anymore. We're not the ones who have political influence really as much anymore. And we're unlikely to get it back. We need to, as the church, embrace weakness. No longer having the cultural top spot, we need to embrace that most likely the church is going to go forward as the minority. And our culture is not going to want to hear what Jesus has to say anymore. But we need to embrace that weakness now. But also as our local church, we need to make ourselves weak for the sake of others. Like, we can gather in here every week with our well-controlled lives as comfortable people who feel strong. But if we fail to make ourselves weak and connect with the people outside of our walls who are in weakness due to drugs, who are in weakness due to alcohol, who are in weakness due to dysfunctional, abusive relationships in their homes, if we will not make ourselves weak to go be with them and make them strong, then we are facing the kind of weakness God does not want us. A church that has no purpose and a church that whose only future is death. We are called to be a church that humbles ourselves and weakens ourselves to go out into the world of weak people who are powerless to sin and death and to offer them Jesus who will give them victory over sin and death. I really want this church to consider what it would look like to embrace that weakness through prayer and fasting. We're coming up on Lent, And every year I try to encourage us to fast and to pray. And I want everybody here to think about, I want everyone here to realize everyone, yes, you are called to be a person of prayer every day, to depend on it like your life depends on it, to depend on it knowing that the people around you depend on your prayer life. This church depends on your prayer life. And if you are not every day praying for yourself, praying for this church, praying for everyone you love in this nation, you are failing to embrace the weakness that is yours. And you need it. But also, we need to become a church that prays. We have a group here that prays on Wednesday afternoons or evenings, I need to know. But we need to learn to pray together. I know a lot of people don't want to pray with other people. It feels uncomfortable. But friends, we got to get over that. We have to learn to pray together. If we are one body as a church, that body needs to pray together. Not just with the prayer warrior, you need to pray with this body, every single one of you. This needs to be what Scripture calls a house of prayer. And prayer and fasting are so important for the life of a Christian because both are ways in which we humble ourselves. When we pray, we are admitting that we need God, and when we fast, we are admitting that we need God, that we are weak in body, and it's only when we are weak in body we realize that He feeds us everything we need by His Word. So friends, it's unpleasant and painful to be weak. Nobody likes it. But Christians are the people who take up their cross daily to follow Jesus. We embrace weakness and pain, not just because that's a realistic way to deal with the painful world, but because it's through pain and weakness that we are able to lift up others and encourage others who are in weakness, that we are able to offer them a salvation that is for the weak. So become weak, and become weak through prayer and fasting. Amen.